Hello and welcome. My name is Randi Hopkins, and before we dig into the panel, we are going to start with a short video. So please enjoy, and I'll be back in a few moments to introduce our speakers today.
The exhibition and the words in the bones addressed inherited identities as grounded in language and in the body, with the understanding that stories of origin cannot exist without a language to tell them in, or without a tongue to carry the words. Three artists featured in the show, Marina Leibiškis, Nugent E. Smith, and Zuzana Varga-Segedi, considered this issue from the perspective of post-colonial and post-communist subjectivities. They reflected on the words that get passed down through generations and the bones of the body one receives. Speaking from their positions as US-based artists with roots in Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and the Caribbean, the artists investigated the contentious heritage of the colonial era and post-communist ruptures and absences in order to address the individual bodily effects of collective trauma. Seeking new models for truly decolonized knowledge, Nugent Smith revisits traditional African systems of spirituality and aesthetics, bringing them into the discussion about the contemporary Black subject. Cultural identity as grounded as language is tackled in his multi-part series Masna My Language. The series has at its center a poem that Smith wrote as a reflection on his disconnection from his Haitian ancestry. An attempt at impossible communication, the work offers an investigation into the acquisition of language, the learning and unlearning, the latter being at the center of decolonized knowledge. Spirit carriers are floating, almost weightless sculptures made with found materials, whose shape was dictated by the shape of the crowns worn by the Yoruba chiefs of West Africa. Each of Smith's carriers is intended to embrace and care for a spirit of a deceased person, specifically an unarmed person of color killed by the police, before the spirit can leave this world. Trauma on site is yet another reflection or language, in this case its power to uphold the colonizing grip of an empire. Here Smith visualized a quote by Jean-Paul Sartre, who wrote about the European colonizer strategy to transform the local elite by branding them with the principles of Western culture. They stuffed their mouth full with high-sounding praises, bland, gluttonous words that stack to the teeth. Born and raised in Uzbekistan, a former Soviet republic in Central Asia, Marina Leibiškis speaks as a simultaneously post-Soviet and post-colonial subject. In a country where nationality is inherited from the father, Leibiškis is considered Jewish. This complexity of her ancestry makes Leibiškis examine the very concept of modern family as an idealistic and romantic construct. The inaccessibility of her own cultural inheritance, from the unreachable family members to the unmarked graves of the Gulag, informed the artist's practice, which is guided by the question, how does one claim one's own territory? Leibiškis is inspired by archaeology, the practice of accessing the lost past through excavation, but also, as she sees it, the science of staring into blank. And it is telling that her works in the exhibition take the form of a family album, or a family album as an archaeological excavation. Zuzana Varga-Segedi works with the memory of communism in her native Hungary and elsewhere in the former Eastern Europe. The artist is preoccupied with the notions of absence and erasure in relation to the communist history of the region and its post-communist present, often nationalistic present. Varga-Segedi uses individual bodies as the measure of scale for geopolitical conflicts. She illustrates the social ruptures through corporeal engagement. The cartographic shape in the site-specific self-portrait, which includes a cut-out from an existing gallery wall, is based on the artist's own body. Varga-Segedi walked through the streets of Budapest, taking panorama photographs, and later focused on the part of the image broken up by the photo-sensing algorithm. Digital calibration as such became a metaphor of a body's phenomenological relationship to the surrounding space. For this exhibition, the artist also brought back the ghost of Georgi Lukács, a statue of the Marxist philosopher and influential literary theorist that was removed from the Szent István Park in Budapest in 2017. And specifically, she brought him back through a number of different digital technologies, including a projection onto the facade of Boston Center for the Arts, giving her these technologies giving her the power to symbolically fight the erasure. In all of the works exhibited in the show, bodies served as carriers of histories. The colonial and communist narratives that Smith, Vargasegedi, and Libiškis inherited are marked with political conflict and personal loss. But their own gestures, the artist's gestures, are constitutive in nature. Through the use of invented languages, recovered historical records, and reconstructed cultural artifacts, the artists create new, empowering narratives of reclamation, revival, and growth. Thank you.
That was a great start. Hello, hi everyone, welcome. I'm Randi Hopkins, she, her pronouns, and I come to you as Director of Visual Arts at the Boston Center for the Arts, an organization supporting visual and performing arts on a large campus in Boston's South End neighborhood. BCA is celebrating our 50th anniversary this year, and our history includes a critically acclaimed program of exhibitions presented in our Mills Gallery. And today, I'm honored to introduce this panel, Mapping the Future, listening to the crossed out historic origin body, which grew out of a beautiful and complicated exhibition, In the Words, in the Bones, which was first introduced to me as the germ of an idea by artist Zuzana Szegedy Varga during the summer of 2018, and was presented in the gallery, as you've just seen, from May 23rd to July 21st, 2019, curated by Magdalena Moskalewicz. And I love seeing that video and remembering what a gorgeous show it was. For a bit of context, Juji asked me to start with very few words about the gallery itself. For those of you who haven't seen us in Boston in person, I want to just say the Mills Gallery has played and continues to play a really unique role in the Boston arts ecosystem. It is one of the very few non-commercial art spaces in our city that's not university affiliated. And for that reason, it has a history of supporting innovative artists, timely projects that might not have found a platform otherwise. We have large front windows in the gallery looking out onto a really busy plaza, and our space attracts visitors with an enormous range of previous exposure to contemporary art. And that is a lot of fun for us, and it really guides our approach to both the selection and the presentation of the exhibitions that we do. For this reason, an exhibition like Juji's that offered multiple points of access and lots of opportunities for dialogue and conversation was really appealing to us. And working with this whole team on In the Words, in the Bones was just a valuable experience, as you can see how much the show came together around the relationships among the people who brought it to life, as well as their own investigations into aspects that they're interested in. So as with the best exhibitions, this one served as an important springboard for further exploration by everyone involved, as today's panel, starting in just a second, will demonstrate. So before I introduce our speakers, I have a few acknowledgements and thank yous. This panel is hosted by the Wellesley College Art Department and pays honor to the legacy of artist and scholar Alice Van Vechten Brown, known at Wellesley for initiating a laboratory system for art historical studies known as the Wellesley Method. As we globally experience the effects of pivotal shifts from East-West and North-South mentalities, conversations that connect artists and art historians are increasingly vital. I also want to say that although our panel is virtual, we acknowledge that our host institution, Wellesley College, is located on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary unceded lands of the Massachusetts tribe, Recognizing the operations taking place on a stolen land, we extend gratitude to the indigenous peoples who have rich histories here, including the Massachusetts, Wampanoag, and Nipmuc nations, for their ongoing stewardship of the land. Exhibition-related panel discussions are generously supported by Wellesley College Art Department, Russian Area Studies Department, Committee on the Lectures and Cultural Events, City of Boston Opportunity Grant, Sampson Projects, Honorary Consulate of Hungary, Boston, Barabasi Lab, and Delta Airlines. And we also want to extend great appreciation to research assistants Emily Scheuer, Anna Kolosova, and Irina Zadvornaya, and special thanks to Edith Andres. So last important housekeeping note, the panel will be in English with one of our speakers presenting in Russian, and translation is available via live captioning, which is on the lower side of your screen. If you have any trouble accessing captioning, throw a note in the chat and we can help walk you through that. So, all right, with all that, I'm excited to get underway. The format for this is going to be, you're going to be hearing from 4 speakers today. You're going to hear from our moderator, critical geographer Zoltan Gineli, Hungary, from artist and art historian Denenge Duyst-Akpem, US, Nigeria, from art historian Valeria Ibraeva, Kazakhstan, and from art historian and exhibition curator Magdalena Moskalewicz. Please join me in welcoming them. We're going to start with introductory statement by Zoltan, followed by brief presentations by the other 3 speakers, after which they're going to join together in conversation. So with that, I am honored to turn today's panel over to Zoltan, and thank you all for joining us. Please be lively in the chat. We love to hear from you.
Okay, hello everyone. Hope you can hear me. My name is Zoltan Gineli, and I'll be moderating this panel and the discussion with the 3 other speakers. And I just, shortly introduce myself. I've already been introduced who I am, what I do, but I just to add some context. I'm from Budapest, Hungary, and I was trained as a geographer, but I working in global history and the topic of how to engage with decolonialism in the context of Eastern Europe from a global historical perspective. And I'll be talking now about just a few things which I think would be important conceptual questions connected to this exhibition project, and also in connection to our own exhibition that we are doing, which really relates to this particular exhibition, which is called the Transperiphery Movement, which is an exhibition in Budapest, Hungary, and is part of the Biennale Budapest. And I'm co-creating it with Esther Szakács. And I wanted to tell you this because this is my own, this is my first attempt to work together with artists and think about how to translate academic work into an exhibition project for the public. So I was very excited with this opportunity and to talk to and engage with artists, the work of artists. So I think from my own academic research and what the Transperiphery Movement exhibition entailed was thinking about the relations between Eastern Europe and the Global South. From a global perspective, do we have a shared history? And are there any parallels in this history, parallels of experience, parallels of social position, of experiences of race and racialization, for example? And how to do an epistemology, construct a new epistemology, which does not look at the West, but just look at these sort of interperipheral relations globally between Eastern Europe and the Global South. And this also connects to discussions around how to link the literature of post-socialism and post-colonialism, which has now grown into a wider dialogue of how to think about decolonial perspective. as related to or connecting these two wider regions. And the next thing I think we should consider is what is the global colonial history of Eastern Europe? Because we usually talk about the relation between the West or the global core, the colonizers and the colonized, which is the global South or the post-colonial South. But then you have the missing Second World or missing Eastern Europe from this whole story. Whereas if we only focus on coloniality, as an epistemology, as a historical approach, we might find a very different global history of Eastern Europe. And there, through that vision, through that perspective, we might find the linkages to the global South. And this turns to the question of what is decolonialism. Now, after the Floyd incident last year, there are now more and more, heated debates about decolonialism, not just in the West or in the global South, but also now in Eastern Europe. And I think we should think about what happens if we included these regions, such as Eastern Europe, in this discussion, in order to think about why there were these geographical separations in the first place. And if an artist or an academic or an activist in the USA, for example, says that he or she is working on a decolonization project, what does it mean for Eastern Europeans? So what I see is the lack of dialogue between Eastern Europeans and those engaged with decolonization projects, which I think this conversation would transform the idea of what does it mean to decolonize. And I think there are 4 things that I want to raise, and then this leads us to the conversation questions, which are raised when we'll start the conversation. One is this geographical separation of civilizationism and hierarchy, a racial and global hierarchy, which dissects these regions. And we need to recover and uncover the linkages, the historical linkages that are actually out there. What we did, for example, in our exhibition project, was looking at the Hungarian folk writers, how they tried in the interwar period, how they tried to fight against Western dependency and think about the sovereignty of Hungary connected to global humanism, which was anti-colonial. They were saying that we are a colonial region, and this is how we are connected to the global South. And at the same time, you could see in the same period, the decolonization movements of, for example, negritude and Pan-Africanism developing in the interwar era. And then these were shared and became sort of shared discussion after the Second World War in the socialist period. And the second thing is whiteness in Eastern Europe. So if we think about whiteness, Eastern Europeans are often regarded as white and as part of Europe, whereas actually Eastern Europeans were also racialized and have these experiences of being racialized and being not quite white. But they themselves also have constructed historically these positions of being non-white, having, for example, Asian roots on the perimeters and peripheries of Europe. And we also have to think about the parallels of colonial history of, for example, the ways that this racialization, subjugation happened historically in Eastern Europe. And now just thinking about the Holocaust, but also the wider histories of, for example, Eastern European migrants going to USA with this kind of shared racialization by the racial states of the colonial, post-colonial countries like the USA or in South America. So there we can find, we can also turn to this question of then, who is the indigenous? Is there an indigenous also in Eastern Europe? And were there these kind of shared experiences of how to, like, as I mentioned, the folk writers, they were also trying to connect to an indigenous, authentic culture from which you can build this kind of serenity. And I think the 2 other things which I wanted to mention is an approach of translucency, of if you put these national canonic figures, for example, in Hungarian literature or history, in a different light, then they show a different side. You can show a different side of their life work. I'm thinking about famous poets like Miklos Radnóti or forgotten writers like Götz Illés, who engaged with negritude and Pan-Africanism, which is totally missing from Hungarian historical thinking. And by only focusing on how they related to Pan-Africanism and of engaging, identifying with the Black man, you can find a different history, which can show how our connections were actually out there and how we related and connected to the global South. And lastly, I think the importance of this transperipheral travel and what does it mean to be a traveler. We also dealt with travelers and how they, through their travels to the global South, or people from the global South, either as workers or writers or intellectuals, transform their ideas of race and of coloniality. So I think we should also try to focus on this interperipheral travel of not looking at the West, but looking at our own histories as they are shared through these connections. So there are 4 things that I will offer as trying to think of when we turn to the conversation. One is demapping, how to demap and offer new geographical perspectives. And the second is transforming the absence and this erasure in our histories and our identities into agency. The third is the historic origin body, which I would like to, which is presented in this exhibition, and I'd like to link this to the transgressive diasporic self. How does the diaspora, the traveler, become a transgressive, offer some sort of transgressive agency? And the fourth is future. What future can we offer through this conversation, and how can we link this to the concept of art as network, as we are also networking, and how can we do an exhibition and a piece of art as it is a network of these relations, positions, and identities. So thank you very much. And now I'd like to give the floor to our panelists. And the order is, as far as I know, is our first speaker will be Denenge Duyst-Akpem. So I'd like to ask Denenge to turn on her video.
Hello, everyone.
Yeah, so the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
All right. Greetings. We have a lot of noise in the background, so I'm going to put my headphones on. All right. Greetings, all. It's good to see you. Glad to be with you today and really honored at this meeting. So I'm going to begin with my presentation here for this session. And I'm just going to take a moment here to share my screen. Okay. All right. Okay, welcome everybody. So I've organized my presentation for this panel as Traversing the Visible Invisible for the Demapping the Future panel. So thank you for inviting me here. And I always like to begin with a goat to locate my own origins, which is rural Nigeria, and also goats are wonderful. And also reference to the artist about whom I'm speaking today. So, and I also like to, as we're thinking about language, I like to start with a greeting. And so Tiv is my father's language. I was born and raised in southeastern Nigeria and in Benue State. And Tiv we begin with greetings that I like to share with everyone. So if you have an opportunity to turn your sound on just to speak along with me, Msu is the hello greeting in Tiv. So it's a long U, Msu.
Msu.
Msu upandave. So you would greet someone in the afternoon, how are you doing? And then the response would be Msu dido, I'm doing very well. So I welcome you here, especially as we're thinking about language and origin and all of these wonderful concepts with a Tiv greeting. So Msu pishi. Thank you for having me. So I begin my presentation here. I've organized into a few categories, and the first one being reclamation and commemoration. And I want to start by talking with you briefly about Gus Edwards, a dramaturge, in his essay, Caribbean Narrative, Carnival Characters in Life and in the Mind, he writes of an initial rootlessness, a separation from the origins of his youth in locating himself in other cultures, that via theater and connections to Carnival and the stories of his youth, he was able to return to these creative and cultural locations, stating that, for it is in your own past, your own pace, your own place that a true theater resides, whether it lives on stage or in the soul. And I consider this with regard to language, which Nugent Smith addresses in Master My Language, and I'll further address this work in later in the discussion. But thinking about the loss of language, whether through forcible removal, for instance, in the religio-colonial projects, such as in the case of Elder Malidoma Patrice Sommet of the Dagara people in Burkina Faso in West Africa. He was kidnapped from his village at age 7, taken to a Jesuit boarding school where all of the boys were indoctrinated in Euro-Western religious practice and made to police each other's use of their own languages by the wearing of a goat skull on scratchy raffia around the neck. The only way to remove it was if you caught someone else speaking their own language, and then you could remove it and they would have to wear it. So this is one method among many, and each country's colonialism had its own toxic flavor in terms of how it was enacted and what the expected aspirations were. There is within this an extraction, this idea of extracting language from the body, an excruciating process for the tongue and especially for the spirit. In Smith's Trauma on-site site, the porcelain teeth contained the grime and the sinister shine of capitalist systems of slavery, the patina of time that harks to mass graves and burial grounds, commemorative remnants, oversized presence that's insistent upon recognition of these histories and the inheritance of colonial trauma on the body. This DNA memory, or the code contained within our cells. This is something that I've been working with in scholarship as well as practice for quite some time. And thinking, for instance, about an earlier work, Alter Destiny 888, which speaks to Sun Ra, speaking of himself as the altered destiny who has come to speak to the people about the possibilities of transformation and liberation. This work sought to heal legacies of trauma located within the womb as fibroids through employment of daily ritual enactment with clay, hair, earth, and dragging the weight of these vestiges through swirling dust. So in Smith's work here, the weight of the ceramic, the largeness of individual pieces is further enhanced by this collective weight, the physical, the energetic, the historic of this assemblage of the teeth. Cacophonous pile that speaks to the excruciating pain, the forced sacrifice and the hidden histories of medical experimentation on Black and brown people's bodies, and usually without anesthesia. All of our medical advancements, as well as our architectures, our languages, our cultural traditions, built upon sacrifice, servitude, chattel slavery, and the labor of Black and brown people that continues to this day. So we seek sites of reclamation, and within such commemoration, there's a relationship between the world of spirits, ancestors, and orishas, known as this world of the ancestors and orishas known as Orun in Yoruba tradition, and the Yoruba being one of the largest ethnic groups from southern Nigeria and Benin, and one of the largest in the diaspora, and the world of the living, or Aye. So Marta Moreno Vega writes in the Candomblé and Eshu Elegua that the balance between these two realms is essential for the well-being and prosperity of those in the world of the living. So in Smith's Spirit Carriers, we see the commemorative within the framework, an aesthetic of the cool, in a sense, as discussed by Robert Ferris Thompson, traditions which stem from West and Central Africa, primarily across a range of ethnic groups and cultural traditions, where evocations of coolness are essential to cool the heating of murder, the heating of death, the heating of violent action. Cooled, the land will be cooled. This is, the aesthetic of the cool, foundational to Yoruba aesthetic and cosmological thought, and rooted in the belief that we come into the world not as full of sin and waiting to be saved, but as balanced and transcendentally cool. And it's through life that we strive to maintain this balance. So this coolness is maintained through ritual, object, gesture, materials, chalk, oil, mushrooms, the colors of blue, leaf green, black like the depths of ocean. And so there's this reference to water in that, the coolness with regard to balance and communication, which is also found amongst the Dogon of Mali, with their cosmological heritage, originating with Nomo ancestors, who are dual gender amphibious entities from the Sirius constellation, specifically Potolo. And so we see in this, this connection, we see in Smith's Spirit Carriers, they're floating, they're swaying, evoking in their palette the depths of water and the coolness and the cooling of these spirits of those who have been taken through violence and other traumatic loss. The predominance of the color black not only references death in the funerary, as well as blackness abstracted from Black personhood in the manner that Black arts movement playwright Ed Bullins deconcretized the concept of Black from Black people, from Black skin, in works such as The Theme is Blackness, to become an experimental experience of Blackness deconstructed. Afrofuturist author Cherie Renee Thomas writes in her introduction to her reclamatory Dark Matter series about Black people in the history of science fiction as dark matter, exerting a pull from the visible invisible. So the object stands for and creates a vessel for spirit, traversing the space in between worlds in a manner referencing the Yoruba Egungun masquerade, which dances the ancestor spirit into the next realm, the masker becoming vessel for spirit. The spirit carriers evoke the encrusted portable altar of the Bamana Boli, which is layered with sacred materials, a kind of an object portal. Smith's works are commemoration, objects of memory that bear witness to histories and present, whispered prayers and conjurations for futures, mnemonic devices that communicate across space and time, material commemorations in a similar fashion as LA-based Noah Purifoy in the late 60s with Sir Watts and other works from the LA artists that were constructed as spirit-filled transformative objects made from the detritus of the destroyed post-uprising landscape. In contrast, for the Yoruba king, the Oba, who is more than a chief, but a divinely ancestrally ordained and guided entity who exists in liminal space, the crown with its conical points, seen also in Smith's Spirit Carriers, functions as a kind of antenna to the realm of the Orishas, this realm of the Orun, emphasizing the primacy of the head or Ori in Yoruba. This pointed design also references the termite mound, which is architectural ecosystem containing naturally sustained heating and cooling ventilation systems. It's a fully integrated living entity itself, comprised of all the parts, queen, ants, earthen structure. And it also exists as a spiritual portal. It's clay used for a range of ritual practices, including the construction of Ibo Mbari, which are richly designed shrines, art galleries, and sacred sites of petition in southeastern Nigeria. There is a saying, great men move slowly, which speaks not only to the aesthetic ladenness and assemblage of royalty, but also the careful deliberation required to maintain leadership amongst a people over time. And there's also a snack from termites. If anyone wants the recipe, I'd be happy to share. It's in my book. The Oba's crown includes faces from the original Oba, the Oduduwa, all the way down through history, showing that the king holds the power of lineage as well as the blessing of our mothers, shown through the birds, elder postmenopausal women without whom the king cannot rule. The beaded veil is separating him from the people and the people from him. So great is the Ache energy that he contains and wields on behalf. The king, the Oba, is a vessel traversing past, present, and future. These portals bear witness to history's present, creating space, crafting lieux de mémoire, sites of memory. In this evocation of Ache power, I look to Dr. Roland Abiodun, who describes Ache as a catalytic life force, implying this catalyzing energy, a dynamic active movement, or Jedape, the power of spiritual command, the power to make things happen. Moreno Vega continues with regard to aesthetic systems that the Yoruba and their descendants introduced an aesthetic vision to the Americas that called the spiritual forces to earth through recitation of special prayers, performances of particular songs, dances, colors, symbols, and instruments. The Yorubas carried with them the belief in the power of ancestral spirits and the forces of nature, which carry the elusive invisible energy force Ache. The power of the word, the energy generated through sacred disciplines, the power to evoke this elusive power, the sacred power. The power to evoke is found in the oriki, praise or citation poetry, which is used in many forms in naming to locate an individual within the world of the living, their path and accomplishments. So in the installation of an oba, for instance, the energy of the oriki, the word force, is so potent that to pass in front of it would be to invite damage to oneself. The word is connected to water, to communication, to a movement between 2 points, and this essential force animates Smith's works. Now, in the activation of the vessel, I look at this concept of the vessel of liberation. And I think about this in Afrofuturism and Afrofuturity, examples of vessels of liberation, whether we're talking about George Clinton's mothership, whether we're talking about the train, the Underground Railroad, conceptual and physical, of future vision, of Black radical imagination on the part of Harriet Tubman, Curtis Mayfield and the train, Lee Scratch Perry and Black Ark Studio, the Ark from Noah's Ark, the biblical story that saved the people. Looking to Sun Ra and his solar orchestra, where he says the music is the vessel of liberation, that we want to teleport the whole planet through music. And then also looking to the work of Amiri Baraka, co-founder of the Black Arts Movement, where he talks about music and rhythm as pathway, linking us ancestrally to a lineage outside, beyond 5 senses, a synesthetic way of operating through rhythm. And finally, this idea that we are each instruments in this vast orchestra. We are the portals, we are the vessels. So as we're traveling this sonic architecture, much of my scholarship has kind of focused on an Afrofuturist lens, this idea of sculpting space, which I coined as a way to describe an intentional shaping of space through object, sound, gesture, daily performance, movement, interaction as a practice of mindful transformation that begins with the self and stretches out into the larger world, liberatory practice and investigation. And sonic architectures is a term that's discussed by Julian Jonker in his essay Whitey on the Moon Dub, thinking about this movement through space-time outside of Euro-Western constrictions and constructions. For instance, in Hindi, there's a word kal that means yesterday or tomorrow. It's all determined by context of how the rest of the words in that. In Black Quantum Futurism, Volume 1, Rashida Phillips, who's a housing rights lawyer, as well as an Afrofuturist and artist. Dr. Imani is one of the writers in this text, writes about Sasa and Zamani conceptions of time among the Swahili of East Africa, which is basically quite similar to Kul, which is this idea of time having overlapping layers, and I'm sort of doing side to side, but it's, you know, we need to shift outside of even our understanding of place and how we think about time. So, you know, we see that language as well directly constructs our ideas of time and can be deconstructed through that as well. Language is code, and code can be employed as a tool of shape-shifting through digital space, rejecting confines of linearity. As Wendy Walters discusses in her essay on the city of Detroit as a city that lives in this sort of destroyed past, a hopeful present, and visions of a technologically advanced future. Within all of this is the figure of Eshu Legba, the Yoruba divine messenger who intercedes on part of Orishas in the world of humans, through whom we can see this trickster shape-shifting methodology as a manner of survival and thriving, especially within the Western world for Black and Brown peoples who have been suffering oppression. And this term thrival is a term coined by Amanda Williams for her collaborative work, Thrival Geographies. In my mind, I see a line, for the 2018 Venice Architectural Biennial. And there is within this as well, Moten and Harney's concept of fugitivity as detailed in the Undercommons within institutional spaces, navigating this visible invisible and thinking about Richard Wright, the Invisible Man, the proto-hacker as described by historian Lisa Yazek, tapping into the mainframe to power his Louis Armstrong records. What is hidden is revealed. This notion of surviving in a sea of double consciousness, the constant threat of white supremacist terrorism, but also rejecting this promulgated myth of white supremacy as the directive of one's life and existence. So my question is always, who has agency? Who controls the future? And thinking about works in sonic architecture like Drexciya, the electronic band from Detroit, who always remained hidden, never showing their faces in public, their music traveling a digital underground, untethered to conventional notions of time and space, traveling digital code, enacting reclamation of histories. For instance, the Middle Passage story of enslaved African women thrown overboard, where Walters writes about Drexciya reclaiming this and saying that the babies will be born into the waters of the Atlantic, growing to aquatic Afronauts who will, quote, return to deliver Whitey a beatdown. So, you know, as with the legend of Ibo Landing, where enslaved people took their futures into their own hands, this story shifts to enact points of agency. This reclamation and activation we see in Sun Ra, we see traveling the spaceways, we see George Clinton and Parliament Funkadelic, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, Stop and Let Me Ride, where your liberation is dependent upon your engagement and activation. Gil Scott-Heron, Revolution Will Not Be Televised. All of this speaks to language as a kind of an activatable code, this communication through dots and dashes, the visual verbal nexus that we find in Akan world, or even looking to Luba Lukasa memory boards, which are divinatory devices, also architectural layers and layers of history. And we find even in, one could say, to cuneiform tablets, or looking at the relationship of humans always loving the handheld device throughout history, whether it's dots, dashes, clay, codes. I will just shift through here as we're thinking about code and language and the deconstruction of language, and referencing also Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind, where he speaks about the cultural bomb, which destroys a people's power and sense of self in their own cultural traditions. There is a term, finally, that Malidoma Patrice Sommet introduces, which is called, I'm going to zip through here, the Yil Bongura, which is the thing that knowledge can't eat. And so I leave you with this, the knowing, the spaces of intuition, the enactment and recollection of indigenous knowledge that are beyond this consumption that we think of within certain institutional spaces. So thank you so much. Za Dido, go well, and I appreciate your attention today.
Thank you very much, Denenge, for this fascinating presentation. We are kind of over time, so I'll give the floor right to Valeria Ibraeva. And please, may I ask panelists to open the chat window and keep a watch out if I give a signal, because I don't want to ruin the recording while you speak. Jump in. Thank you very much. Valeria?
Hello. Hello, everyone. I'm Kritika and curator from Kazakhstan, and I would like to present my paper on Russian, probably to show the diversity of colonial languages. So, название моего доклада «Как объяснить картину мертвому зайцу». Средняя Азия, в которой я живу, в течение последних 300 лет была одним из самых закрытых и таинственных мест на Земле. История региона одновременно постколониальная и постсоветская. В течение 20 века регион пережил смену 3 формаций. Был частью Российской империи, далее сырьевой окраины Советского Союза, и сейчас, последние 30 лет, он состоит из 5 независимых республик с авторитарными режимами. В силу географических и климатических особенностей регион делится на земледельческую часть, это современные Узбекистан и Таджикистан, а также территории, где развивалось кочевое животноводство. Это нынешний Казахстан, Кыргызстан и Туркмения, что, конечно, по сию пору ощущается, в том числе в искусстве и в культуре. Официально советская идеологическая модель была врагом колониальной политики Российской империи. Считалось, что советская власть освободила национальные окраины из тюрьмы народов, создав на территории Туркестанского генерал-губернаторства и своих протекторатов Бухарского Эмирата и Хивинского ханства новые союзные республики. Их формирование продлилось с 1925 по 1936 годы, в результате чего 5 республик – Казахстан, Узбекистан, Кыргызстан, Таджикистан и Туркмения – образовали собой Советский Восток. Причудливое политико-географическое понятие, должное показать другим азиатским народам их светлое будущее. С этой целью сюда, по мандату советского правительства, официально сформулировано как командировка для укрепления и развития национальных искусств, прибывали русские художники, позже ставшие костяком одного общего института – Союза художников СССР. Присылали, конечно, не только художников, но и архитекторов, инженеров, рабочих, специалистов и, разумеется, советских руководителей. В 1929 году вышел документальный фильм «Турксиб. Стальной путь» российского режиссера Виктора Турина, входящий в список самых выдающихся фильмов XX века. Парадоксальным для власти образом этот фильм ярко выявил колонизаторскую сущность нового режима, документально запечатлев ничью землю, в которую вгрызаются металлические монстры, строители железной дороги, и на контрасте местных жителей, бесконечно подвозящих тюки шерсти и хлопка к вагонам. Кадры, в которых всадники на верблюдах, лошадях и быках не могут догнать паровоз, становятся очень прозрачной метафорой преимуществ прогрессивного советского строя. Но одной только колониальной экономики для полной победы социализма было маловато. Основной целью советской власти стало воспитание нового советского человека, основным методом лишения его памяти. Инструментарий был достаточно разнообразным. Во-первых, это железный занавес, поскольку выведение нового типа людей удобнее производить в закрытом инкубаторе. Другие способы – это искусственно организованный голод, казни за инакомыслие, трудовые концлагеря, переселение народов. Трижды менялась графика. от арабицы к латинице, а затем кириллице. Поколения граждан Советского Востока потеряли доступ к знаниям предков. Таким образом, к концу 1950-х годов в Советской Средней Азии сложилось сообщество людей, почти начисто лишенных памяти. Не только о семье, происхождении, но и истории своего народа, языке, территории, государстве. Важную роль в этом процессе сыграли советские художники, чьей задачей стало создание иллюзорного мира счастливых людей, увлеченных трудом на хлопковых и пшеничных полях, металлургических комбинатах, в шахтах и в степи, наполненных тучными отарами овец, на ядерных и космических полигонах, откуда стартовали советские ракеты. Получив независимость в 1991 году, новые страны стали восстанавливать или строить свои истории, предпочтительно великие. Процесс официальной деколонизации парадоксальным образом копирует собой метрополию, причем в ее монархическом изводе, игнорируя декларации о провозглашенной демократии. Установленные повсюду памятники Ленину заменяются конными национальными героями, часто на тех же пьедесталах. Президенты строят себе ампирные дворцы и барочные памятники самим себе. Живописцы пишут их портреты и батальные сцены далекого прошлого. Начинаются съемки исторических фильмов и сериалов, в основном о событиях X-XV веков, часто под прямым патронажем президентов и их близких. И надо признать, этот официальный кинематограф неплохо справляется с темой «Ничья земля», рассказывая о старинном укладе жизни, ритуалах, верованиях, народе, его героях. Изживание колониальной травмы через реалистическое воссоздание исторического прошлого, пусть даже грешащего излишним пафосом и дидактикой, успешно работает не только в Казахстане, где сняты фильмы «Кочевник», «Казахское ханство», «Тамирис». В Узбекистане сейчас вышел на экраны фильм «Я и есть Джалаладдин». Но также работает и во второсортных, по выражению Мадины Тластановой, империях в России и в Турции. Но для изживания двойной травмы, колониальной и советской, опять же, одной историко-этнической идеи, характерной для всех постколониальных стран, явно недостаточно. Тем не менее, новые государства с энтузиазмом поддерживают это направление, поскольку далекая история дает возможность вольных интерпретаций, где главную роль играют султаны, ханы, герои. Исследование ближней советской истории не очень поощряется, так как во главе государства все еще стоят бывшие коммунисты. По-прежнему рассматривая культуру как инструмент обслуживания власти, они категорически не замечают современного искусства, существующее в основном за счет энтузиазма и мировых культурных фондов. И правильно делают, поскольку работы альтернативных художников резко отличаются от официальных, реабилитирующих авторитаризм. Созданные вне идеологических рамок работы художников из Казахстана Зои Фальковой и Ербалсына Мельдебекова рассказывают об этой самой ближней истории, репрессиях и искусственном голоде. Они используют совсем простые и дешевые средства, находя мощные метафорические образы. Оба, как, впрочем, и многие местные художники, особенно в Казахстане, используют натуральные природные материалы, необходимые в кочевом быту. Кожа, войлок, дерево, кость. То, что окружало кочевника в степи и чем он пользовался для постройки юрты, изготовления одежды, посуды, конной упряжи. То есть все то, что окружало его в жизни. Работа Ербалсына Мельдебекова «Тавро», созданная в 2014-2015 годах, это то, что увидел художник на фабрике по переработке шкур крупного рогатого скота, а именно это цифровые клейма, поставленные пастухами для учета поголовья. Собственно говоря, это ready-made, просто татуированные шкуры животных. Художник располагает их по возрастанию цифрового значения клейм, словно цитируя Ремарка: «Одна смерть – трагедия, смерть миллионов – статистика». Еще более мучительно читаются пропуски в нарастании цифр, например, 845 и следующая 7225. Умолчание о тех, кто не попал даже в статистику. Ассоциация с концентрационными лагерями несомненна. В работе «Род открытого неба», созданном в 2019 году, Зоя Фалькова также использует натуральные материалы и также обращается к статистике. В 1924 году в Казахстане насчитывалось 6 миллионов человек и 47 миллионов голов скота. В 1934 году население составило 2,5 миллиона и 4 миллиона скота. Голод в кочевом обществе Казахстана было организовать легко, заставив граждан войти в оседлые колхозы. Лишенные пропитания, животные вымирали, а вместе с ними и люди. Художница смешала человеческие зубы и зубы животных, поместив их в зеркальный бокс. Теперь степь, покрытая костями, простирается во все стороны. Десоветизация, деколонизация предполагает не только возвращение коллективной памяти, но и индивидуальной, личной, касающейся не только коренных народов, но и пришлых. Современному искусству Средней Азии, как, впрочем, и всему советскому, не очень свойственны личностные интонации. Это и есть знак типичного для советского общества приоритета коллективного над личным. Даже в современной лексике сохранился оборот, маркирующий принадлежность человека к какой-то группе – представитель. Свои глубоко личные переживания в контексте исторических пертурбаций осмелились показать пока только две художницы из Узбекистана. Причем обе не живут на родине. Саадат Исмаилова во Франции, а Марина Лейбишкис в США. В 2021 году Саадат Исмаилова на выставке «Как меня звали» показала инсталляцию, собранную из 20 антикварных чичванов, сеток из конского волоса, которыми узбечки закрывали лица. Неоновые трубки, висящие в центре инсталляции, обозначали имя художницы, написанное смешанными шрифтами, уже упомянутой арабицей, латиницей и кириллицей. Таким образом, путалась в графике бабушка Саадат. Работа посвящена истории советского Узбекистана и рассказывает о насильственной эмансипации женщин, которые должны были показательно сжигать паранджи. Эта кампания, получившая название «Худжум», осуществленная в 20-30-х годах, была весьма рискованной для женщин. Коллективистское большевистское одобрение сталкивалось с агрессивностью семьи, непривычной к столь радикальным жестам и вполне способной на ответные. Имя женщины, в данном случае самой художницы, которая периодически требовалось писать разной графикой, также лишало ее идентичности. И речь шла уже не об этничности, религии или традиции, а о самом сокровенном для каждого человека. Две работы Марины Лейбишкис, созданные в США и показанные на выставке 2019 года в Бостоне, «Белый альбом» и «Черный альбом», интересно прочитываются через постсоветскую оптику, хотя первая ассоциация, конечно, Холокост. Находясь за железным занавесом, советский гражданин был полностью изолирован от внешнего большого мира, мог знать и иметь только то, что позволено властями. Иметь родственников за границей считалось предосудительным. Такой персонаж не вызывал доверия и был по определению неблагонадежным. В мешанине переселений, репрессий, ссылок и эвакуаций на территории СССР Многие семьи оказались раскиданы по свету, но узнать их судьбу было очень сложно и почти невыполнимой задачей. Человеку оставалось только предполагать то, что случилось с родными. Так, в белом альбоме художница создает придуманные биографии своих утерянных родственников, фотографии которых запекает в керамических панелях и помещает в лайтбоксы. Сквозь фарфор высвечиваются туманные разводы и тени. Отсылка к нацистским печам достаточно прозрачна. Но художница включает в проект размышления о памяти, описание виртуальных и реальных путешествий по миру, вспоминает литературных и мифологических героев мировой истории. В этом ряду сложных ассоциаций и размышлений о памяти встречается также имя Каспара Хаузера, человека из ниоткуда, не имеющего семьи, не помнящего родства, не понимающего, где он находится, не умеющего разговаривать и коммуницировать. В принципе, таким образом можно описать ощущение 350 миллионов советских граждан после падения советского железного занавеса. Тема предполагаемой памяти, предполагаемой судьбы развивается в черном альбоме, где черные обугленные силуэты восстанавливают события не из непосредственного знания, а из истории, фильмов, рассказов. До сих пор во многих семьях сохранились фотографии с вырезанными из них лицами, ретушированными фигурами. Часто в семьях отсутствует информация о дедушках и бабушках. Постсоветские люди умеют читать эти знаки, свидетельствующие о наличии в семье репрессированных родственников, как правило, расстрелянных или сгинувших в лагерях. Эта ближняя память все еще опасна для режимов новых стран Средней Азии. Поэтому ни в одной из них нет музея современного искусства, нет программ для его развития, нет поддержки для международного сотрудничества. Вместе с тем, государства страстно желают международного успеха, узнаваемости, видимости. Казахстан, в частности, периодически посылает свои исторические фильмы на «Оскар», проводит гастроли оперного театра за рубежом за свой счет и делает массу других смешных вещей в полной уверенности, что процессом искусства можно управлять. Но получает признание разве что в фильмах Саши Барона Коэна. Усилия же современного искусства медленно, но верно увенчиваются успехом. Его выставляют на документе, на биеннале в Венеции, Стамбуле, Сиднее, покупают центр Помпиду, Стейделик-музей, музей современного искусства в Лос-Анджелесе, Сингапуре, Брюсселе. Не случайно первая большая выставка искусства Средней Азии в 2002 году в Доме мировых культур в Берлине называлась No Man's Land. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Valeria, for this fantastic talk. And thank you. Let's move on to Magdalena, right? Magdalena Moskalewicz. Could you please start? Thank you.
Hi. I will try to be brief because I know we are running out of time, so I'll speak freely rather than read a script. You also already saw a video that I pre-recorded before that discussed the exhibition in the words in the bones. And as you saw, this exhibition really was grounded in the question of identity. And as such, it was really full with conflict of different kinds. If we think of identity as something that is always stretched between what is constructed, socially and culturally constructed, and what is considered original or authentic, such as one's body, though of course we know that bodies also are very heavily constructed to be a certain way. If we think of racialized or gender construction. And it was really a conversation between three individuals in a way that was very intimate. So it was small scale, and I wouldn't want to like claim any big words here as like mapping or demapping like whole three regions of the world, because of course I couldn't possibly. At the same time, this question of scale is a question that comes in as a very prevalent and poignant thing here, because specifically the scale is the problem very often when we speak about things like mapping in art history or in other disciplines of the humanities. If we look specifically at the conversations that have been happening in the art world and in the cultural production, very often these large-scale exhibitions or large-scale academic projects that claim to like finally be all-inclusive, ultimately very often, in a very also unfortunate way, sometimes unintentional way, end up being a much more a neo-imperialist enterprise, in that by an intention, maybe well-meant intention to map more than simply the Western world, end up just repeating those gestures of the former colonizers, these accumulative gestures that just wanted to gather knowledge, organize and categorize knowledge, cultural production of the whole world through their own pre-imposed categories that, of course, were very local to the Western way of thinking. But were masquerading as somehow potentially universal or the only possible. And this conversation about scale is crucial here, I think, in how, on a local perspective of a single individual, we can relate to these broader processes that we are always subordinated to and that are difficult, if not impossible, to escape. And here the work of Zuzanna Varga-Szegedy really comes into play, and this wonderful work, site-specific work that she did for us for the exhibition, the map on the wall, really brings into the conversation this relationship between an individual body and a map and the process of mapping. If you remember, Zuzanna made this work by walking through Budapest and actually taking photographs with a camera attached to her body, but then it was through the algorithm abstracted to some extent and imposed onto the white cube space of the gallery. And this type of mapping or demapping and mapping brought back to the scale of an individual body makes me think about what I think, and I think we can all agree, is the most crucial element of decolonizing practices, and that is unlearning. Unlearning the way of thinking about the world that had been imposed onto us. And here I find the thought of Ariela Aisha Azulay extremely productive and extremely fruitful when she speaks about unlearning a number of different imperialist categories, and she discusses imperialist spatiality specifically, so a certain type of demarcation and visualization of the world and of the countries that needs to be unlearned. She also speaks about imperialist temporality, so a way of thinking about time as a linear time, a way of thinking about periodization that is always grounded in some grand moment in the history of the world, such as, let's say, the French Revolution, that we still consider to be like the beginning of the modern era. So to learn the imperialist spatiality, to learn the imperialist temporality, to unlearn those concepts. And this really comes with the understanding that we really cannot decolonize anything without decolonizing knowledge, so without decolonizing our own epistemological perspectives. Yes, so sorry, I lost my train of thought a bit because I'm trying to skip over my script a tiny bit. But so coming back to Zuzanna's work, I mentioned mapping in relation to the body and unlearning these different imperialist spatialities. And the other work that she made for the exhibition, especially in the exhibition, where she brings back the ghost of Georgi Lukács to haunt us in Boston. She later also took it around the world. And showed it in different places. She enters a very specifically Eastern European conversation. And this is a conversation that I think can be a cautionary tale about trying to find one's own place in this complex post-colonial or decolonial world and discourse. And this is one that unfortunately is very often the case in Eastern Europe, in that we, and I speak as we since I am originally from Poland, in trying to find one's own place in this reconfigured geopolitics, we tend to look at ourselves as a potential previously colonized subject. So it has been the case, especially since the fall of communism in the past 30 years, that the local countries of the former Soviet bloc, the European countries, the European satellites of the former Soviet bloc, are trying to find their own identity in this new post-Cold War configuration. And in this search for local identity very sadly actually leads to nationalism and to the revival of almost a total 19th century style of thinking about the nation and the connections between people as grounded in ethnicity, in language, and in religion. And here in bringing this statue of Lukács, Szegedi Berga joins this conversation specifically because this is a monument to the great literary theorist, also a Marxist thinker who was originally Jewish Hungarian. The statue that had been erected in 1985, so still during communism, in a park in Budapest, and removed, I believe it was 2017, so very shortly before our exhibition, in one of the many new cultural policies introduced by the Hungarian government to really erase a certain type of identity from the shared commonality of the Hungarian nation. And so these bringing back the statue, but not really reconstructing it, but bringing it as this ghost that haunts us and then haunts other buildings and other places where Szegedi presented it, such as Israel, for example, really shows this danger of sleeving into nationalism in one's own attempt to find an identity. And in this misguided attempt at an identity is something that can actually be found among a group of people as solidified and already in place. So to that, I think I would just maybe like to go back to Ariela Aisha Azulai's idea of unlearning. So the unlearning this imperialist spatiality, temporality, but she also says that we should unlearn a number of categories that are really embedded in our being in the world, such as the category of a good liberal citizen. And I find this one particularly difficult for myself. If we think of cultural production as actually a part of being a good liberal citizen, as engaging with museums, engaging with the literary, cultural, visual art discourse. So I feel like this is more a task for us that is extremely difficult, that I maybe would like to leave us all with, also as an introduction to this conversation. Here, I really loved Denenge's concept of the vessels of liberation, because in my mind, it really connects to this question of unlearning and unlearning different ideas. So what can be our vessel of liberation in this quest to unlearn the pre and post imperialist concept? So yeah, I think I'll leave us with that.
Thank you very much. Okay, here again. And now let's turn towards the conversation. So I'd like all of the panelists to please turn on your mics and your video first. And based on what you discussed, and this I think the first thing that I'll start with, and an idea to talk about, is really connected to what Magda has been telling us about demapping. As I said in my introduction, there were like 4 topics that I would try to offer as discussion topics, but it doesn't matter if we don't have time or we don't have to discuss all of them. So we'll have around, I think, at least 30 minutes for discussion, and then we'll go to the Q&A. And I'd just like to ask the audience, if you will have any questions, you can already start writing in the chat if you want to. So then in the Q&A, we will have a couple of minutes to turn those questions and you could raise your hand. So for now, to the panelists, demapping. So from my perspective as a geographer, modern maps are, colonial products. So geography was a colonial science. And accepting that, we have to understand that they still structure our geographical knowledge. or mental maps and global navigation. So Africa was also a continent in continents were constructed by Europeans, right? The order of continents. There was also a hierarchy of continents. And then if you think about Pan-Africanism, for example, they tried to transform that idea into an emancipative concept. So this is just one example. So maps reveal, uncover, and connect. We could use that, but on the other hand, through visualization, they also erase via abstraction and fix, and maps are about controlling. So how can we unlearn to map without re-hierarchizing power, how to evade this colonial gaze and create new geographies that connect, reveal, and remain open, connective, and transformative? So what do you think about these geographies, new forms of geographies, which could be, as we discussed, soundscapes, colorscapes, patterns, or languages? So what do you think that through this finding out new geographies, can the colonial experience connect our histories and positions in trying to unlearn and demap? What do you think? And if one of you would like to speak, just ask and I try. There's no specific order. Would anyone like to start?
I'll jump in.
Okay, Denenge. I saw it on your face that you wanted to.
Oh yeah. You must be a teacher. We always know when there's someone who wants to say something. So thank you so much, Zoltan. This is wonderful. I wanted to just sort of riff on what you were mentioning, and also Magdalena, about this idea of unlearning. This is something that I think a lot about and present within the framework of Afrofuturity, Afrofuturism, as this liberatory practice, an applied Afrofuturism, you know, not just the concept, but, you know, but I go back to thinking about Malcolm X, who's sort of the foundation of, you know, Black Arts Movement when after he was assassinated, and he would talk about the unbrainwashing, you know, of a people, that this is an action that we have to be very critically engaged and mindfully, intentionally. So I always go back, you know, to whether it's Ngugi wa Thiong'o with the cultural bomb, or, you know, always back to this idea of the decolonizing of the mind, the starting with the individual, but then also, and I teach survey of African art at the school, so we are constantly engaged in this question about this construction of Africa, you know, thinking about Kwame Anthony Appiah writing about, you know, the arts of Africa with regard to gold weights, where, you know, they weren't considered to be art objects. We put that framing on them. And, you know, and they were there to do a task, even though they had aesthetic quality. But, you know, if it was a leopard or a design, you know, a bit of the ear would be pinched off, you know, because if it doesn't weigh properly, then it doesn't work. So thinking about also the construction of the primitive with regard to the continent, you know, that this was a very intentional project, you know, speaking of colonial project, you know, and then so that, you know, post slavery with abolition, now we need new sources of income, new sources, you know, to pillage. So let's construct this idea of darkness, not thinking about Mansa Musa in 2060, who was, you know, the richest man who's ever lived, and, you know, like the wealth. And so I guess I always go back to this idea that it's all construction, and we think we may be operating as we think we know, but that this is a white supremacist project, an imperialist project that specifically, whether it's voodoo in Haiti, you know, and it's very specifically constructed to be something negative because of fear of the white oppressor, and because Haiti was the first free Black nation. So we got to do something to, you know. So that's one way that I enter into it, is like acknowledging that intentional construction.
Magda,
I could see it on your face that you had something in connection to this. Also,
you know, I think there are a lot of things we can do. And there are a lot of very simple, practical things that can be done. If we think, again, answering your question about demapping and reimagining the world differently, they're very simple, but they're also very radical. Can we get rid of all the maps that just continue this model of depicting the world where Africa is like made tinier than it originally was, and that actually distorts the actual relationships, like distance relationships, but we're used to it. It's really only a visual convention, but everyone is used to depicting the world like that. Can we do that? Yes, we can do that, but it would take really radical steps by governments who control educational programs in those countries that actually have, state-controlled education, and reintroduction of maps. There are designers who make adapted maps. I actually have one hanging in my studio, and I can't believe I can remember the name of the guy who designed it, where the world is upside down. I mean, upside down, if you think of, what is the right side up, the way we have been taught, where these sizes are also adapted. So, there are easy ways, but there are radical ways. And I think we are at the point where we realize that to demap, detangle, unlearn, we really need to take radical steps. Because I think the decades of conversation and thinking and hoping that things will change by themselves is over. I mean, and by detangling, I mean detangling knowledge from imperialism, but I also think of detangling knowledge from capitalism, which I think is probably even more difficult to do, especially if we think from the position of the United States. If you think of maps today, everyone uses Google Maps, right? We don't even think anymore about the map that hangs on the wall. We think of Google Maps, which we all know was developed as actually a military tool for the American military, right? And now we're very happily using it on our phones to get to the grocery store. So I think it's also largely about, I mean, as I said, radical steps from decision makers, but also making yourself uncomfortable in taking the steps that will actually have, an impact on a meaningful change, but that might somehow discomfort you at the beginning when you decide to take these steps. So I don't think it's an easy task. I think it's a possible task. I think we can imagine what the future would look like. And here, following Angela Davis, we can imagine. I want to be able to believe that we can imagine a better future. It doesn't mean that's going to be easy or that it's going to be quick.
Yes, and Valeria, do you have something on your mind connected to demapping?
Oh, Роллс. Ага. Ну, я буду говорить по-русски. Ну, тут довольно сложно. Буквально сегодня у нас произошли столкновения на таджико-киргизской границе. То есть ремэппинг происходит буквально, в буквальном смысле. Поэтому нам вообще, наверное, сложно, находясь так далеко от мира, еще и замахиваться на какие-то глобальные вещи. Мы еще сами себя не понимаем. Ну, например, вот вы все уже поняли, что такое капитализм и насколько он плох. А для нас он еще, то есть, ну, например, мы очень плохо себе представляем, что такое право частной собственности, как это что-то иметь вообще. То есть пока мы только рады тому, что мы можем общаться с миром. Ну, до 2019 года это были какие-то поездки, сейчас это вот благодаря интернету. То есть на самом деле для нас это расширение границ, культурных границ, и это очень важно, и контакты с миром. Для нас вот в этом и заключается изменение границ, изменение карты мира.
So this is, of course, I'll be translating for Valeria here. This is, of course, a very complex problem. In Central Asia, mapping is happening now, like today in the literal sense. Yesterday, there was a skirmish at the Tajik-Kyrgyz border. And so the idea of maps as static is also something that doesn't necessarily make sense in all places around the world. And there are also layers to this issue, right? Because it's difficult to make sweeping statements about mapping the world when we don't know where the maps of our own peoples lie. We still don't know ourselves, and those things change daily. We also know, for example, have issues with the economic elements of this. We all know how bad capitalism is. We all understand that, but we still are having issues with the idea of private property. That's still a somewhat foreign concept to a lot of people in Central Asia culturally, and the ability to relate to and converse with the world through the internet or through the sort of widening of borders, if you will, culturally and literally, is still something that's novel enough that people are more glad about it than they are critical at the moment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Yeah, I mean, in my work, I engage with critical cartography to find out ways of some kind of participatory mapping. If you have an exhibition, for example, in our case, the Trans-Periphery Movement exhibition, where you have several episodes, historical episodes in the exhibition space, and the people coming to the exhibition can connect themselves, all these episodes, by their movement. So they actually demonstrate these connections by finding the traces in the histories. So it's also, I think, a performative thing. And when we could talk about art as network, to how to perform this mapping in an exhibition and how to connect these things. And the last thing I wanted to share is the problem of decolonizing, museums, collections, and exhibitions is mostly focused on the West. And we have this issue in Eastern Europe that it's not really as you might know, Magda, it's not really a common thing to do that. But then again, do we have to do the same thing? Does it make a difference? And, decolonization should be a global project. It's not just, putting in a curator somewhere in London to be more, Sure. It should be something that is a shared project. So in demapping, we also have to uncover these connections in order to understand how to do it, how to do decolonization, if you are. Do you have any thoughts on this? I see you are all affirming, especially Valeria.
I'll jump in too.
So I am happy.
Should I?
Denenge, do you want to start first?
Sure, I'll go for it. I wanted to, Nugent had sent this poem. This is The Cartographer Tries to Map a Way to Zion, which is a part of his work in the exhibition by Kay Miller. And I was going to this one line in there. I mean, everything is amazing, but my job is to imagine the widening of the unfamiliar and also the widening ache of it, to anticipate the ironic question, how did we find ourselves here? My job is to untangle the tangle, to unworry the concerned, to guide you out from the cul-de-sacs into which you may have wrongly turned. And that just, so many layers of thinking about mapping and also around language that, to go back, Magdalena, to what you were saying about the many ways that, the many, opportunities we have. I think for myself, when I think about applied Afrofuturity, for instance, this sort of thinking of, rooting in the past, being aware of oneself in the present, and thinking of opportunities for future, for self and community. And I look at projects, whether it's, Rashida Phillips at the Community Futures Lab in North Philly, but even looking at someone like Emory Douglas, who was the, I don't know if he still considers himself to be the Minister of Culture for the Black Panther Party, but he was the revolutionary artist. And so he's the one who came up, for instance, with that idea of police as pigs. And, people would tell him their stories and he would draw it. And then these images went up, on the walls of the community. And so there was this with the poetry broadsides, this idea of let's get the word, the message, even this idea of the broadside. One of the definitions is the side of the ship from which the guns are fired. So there's this very, Black arts movement, poetic, rapid fire, get the word out there, even in the kind of language and the methodologies that they used. And so, I look at even, Emory Douglas has done work with the Polynesian Panthers. He's done work with Maori artists where they took the New Zealand flag and flipped it upside down and did these graphic designs. And so even just that gesture of flipping the flag upside down into sort of the symbol of a particular geography, of a particular national identity. So he's applying those kinds of concepts that for me is a kind of Black radical imagination. That's where it all stems from. So or Ron Eglash using fractal concepts from African architectural systems and hair plaiting to create a curriculum for public schools, which are traditionally so limited in the way that they construct a curriculum. It's all about testing in this country. And so using hair plaiting as a way to teach elementary students math, something are already familiar with this particular system, but then it becomes a new way to understand culture in that framework. So for me, these are the kinds of things as, even hair plaiting there's a history of mapping, a history of liberatory,
the scale of the body.
Movement. Absolutely, absolutely. So yeah, I could say more about decolonizing the museum, but I'll stop for now.
Do you others have some thoughts on this?
Sure, I totally agree with you. That's why I was nodding that these are conversations that have to happen locally because all the situations locally are so different. But at the same time, the biggest difficulty is that these are local conversations that we also want to be having globally, right? Because we recognize the similarities with all the different, we recognize the similarities between our own struggles. So I think the task here is to how to, reconcile this necessity for science and cultural specificity with the need and desire to have these conversations on a global scale. And I'm sorry that I'm like pointing to the difficulties all the time, but I feel like I'm at the end of the semester. I've been thinking through these things and, I'm just like stuck at the things that I still can't exactly figure out. So this is the thing that I can't still exactly figure out of how to have these conversations globally without overlooking these local specificities, like the specificity of Central Asia that Valeria so brilliantly explained to us, that is so still unknown because it's one of these regions that like stuck between other bigger regions that people think they understand from, for example, the US American or Western European perspective. And they're not even aware of its existence. But here to offer some more positive thought is, we really are not pioneers in this. This is not a new task. And here again, I'm learning from Azulay, who I just find so inspiring when she says that the category of newness, something being new, is also something that we need to unlearn because these struggles have been happening for centuries. People have been resisting the colonialism locally for centuries. It's not like we now arrive and say, oh, let's actually now we realize how bad it was, I don't know, in Morocco or in what is now South Africa or in what used to be Indochina, right? Like there were people locally, there were local activists whose histories might be forgotten, but they have been actively creating the struggle for us. So we can learn from them. And as an art historian, of course, I'm very prone to learning from history and going back to undigging and finding those stories of people who have been providing the path and showing us the path. And when you were speaking, just to offer one example, there was an artist in Hungary in 1968 or 69 who makes a work in solidarity with Bobby Seale, who is gagged in a courtroom in Chicago during the court case of the Chicago 7, right? So there is a communist subject who's identifying with a Black Panther Party member because he recognizes that this is a shared struggle that they actually are sharing, over the Berlin Wall, over the very divided world and against all odds and all the dissimilarities that divide them. So yes, I'm trying to say it's a difficult task, but there are models that we can follow.
Valeria?
Я. Один из примеров десоветизации музея я видела в Национальном музее Пекина. Я ужасно хотела посмотреть их китайский соцреализм. Ну, вы, наверное, знаете, это огромное здание из 5 этажей, огромное просто. На первом этаже находился отдел древнего искусства, и все остальные 4 я просто изнемогала, хотела посмотреть. И все 4 этажа были пустые, огромные. Они были просто пустые. Это прекрасно, то есть спрятали работы советского периода и стерли большой кусок истории. И я не знаю, ну, мне показалось, что это прекрасный принцип, прекрасный пример того, как официальные режимы пытаются просто забыть о том, что было. Ну, это, конечно, очень дурной пример. Ну, как нам поступать в данном случае? Только контакты и обучение, только это, к сожалению.
So, yes, Valeria says that one example of what we might call de-Sovietization of museums she observed in China, in the National Museum in Beijing, where there is a huge museum. The National Museum is 5 floors. It's this absolutely gigantic building. And Valeria really wanted to see the collection that they have of social realist art, like from the socialist period. And so she went to the museum, and on the first floor, there was all the ancient art. And then she got really excited to go up to the second floor and see the Surrealism period. And floors 2, 3, and 4 of this huge, gigantic building were totally empty. There was nothing there. The museum curators or whoever was in charge had hidden all of the work and sort of the artistic evidence, if you will, of that period. And Valeria was saying that this is a wonderful and horrible example of official erasure of a whole period of time and trying to pretend that something simply didn't happen, and that there's this idea of decolonizing or desovietizing museums in a way that can hide the evidence, sweep things under the rug, so to speak. And that obviously that's not the direction that we want to go in this, but what we can do is only make connections and educate as much as possible. That's all we have at the moment.
Thank you. I just want to add that in my research on the exhibition project, we also uncover these kind of letters and correspondence between, for example, Du Bois and Hungarian artists or writers. And these are totally or between like one who wrote the first novel. Kind of initiatives to actually build these connections that we now are trying to engage with. I think what Valeria was talking about really connects to the second issue of transforming absence and erasure into agency, right? This is something that this exhibition is really, I think, about. So we have all these hidden, forgotten histories we try to map or try to show, but reconstruction then becomes a reification. There are various competing narratives of identification projected onto us and woven into us, our lives, like nation, religion, ethnicity, or gender, or language. This really connects to Marina's work. And we have our own absences and built from different knowledge. So then, having a lost origin, as Marina tries to show, seems hostile as it instabilizes, but may enable building something new, maybe a new integration of traces. So I'm really interested in this in terms of the post-socialist and post-colonial thinking, and connected to Nugent's cutouts and the negative spaces he creates, or creating a new language, and also connected to Zsuzsi's, lastly, the dislocation and having no physical presence of Lukács, who becomes some sort of this kind of nomadism. And this connects to her position of being a displaced artist. So what do you think of this transforming absence and erasure into agency?
That's for me.
Valeria,
Yeah.
if you'd like to start.
That's I would like ask Rose to explain me the question, please. Rose.
Так, вопрос о деколонизации музеев и о трансформации, стирания этого официального родства памяти в какое-то агентство художников или людей, как нам трансформировать или как вообще возможно трансформировать стирание это в какое-то художественное или жизненное зерно какого-то будущего.
Ну, о стирании памяти, во всяком случае, у нас делают очень много работ, в частности, очень много работ. Художники об этом думают, о том, что просто убрать какой-то кусок истории, ближний или дальний, из общественного, как общественное достояние, это невозможно. Тем не менее, это происходит и в Америке сейчас, когда сносят памятники, чего я не люблю в любом виде. То есть это называется, в Украине это называлось декоммунизация, в Штатах у вас я не помню, как это называлось, но мне кажется, это как раз один из ходов, то есть возможно противостоять стиранию памяти, ну, хотя бы в уличной скульптуре, когда можно каким-то образом пояснять, почему бы хотелось, например, снести этот памятник, или почему убрали работу, которая висела в музее много лет, а потом вдруг исчезла. Но это, опять же, наверное, какие-то фантазии, хотя мне очень бы хотелось, чтобы даже памятник Сталину где-то стоял, потому что, когда дети спрашивают, кто такой Ленин, а это, извините, почти 100 лет истории, и ты уже не можешь им это объяснить, то, наверное, они должны оставаться. Ну вот я не знаю, вот так.
Хорошо. Так, the erasure of memory is a major theme in art in Central Asia. There are a lot of works being done about this and about the impossibility and yet sort of the impossible commonplace of taking a chunk of history or a chunk of memory which is removed from its context and trying to build or like recreate a past and a future out of that. That this is something artists are thinking about a lot. Valeria also mentioned that the reconstruction and sort of reification of the past is something that also happens in the United States. And she brings up that the removal of sculptures and statues, which is currently happening in the United States, echoes to her with the removal of statues in Ukraine. And this kind of de-Sovietization policy, which Valeria worries about because it has the potential to make it more difficult to engage with horrible history, she says, and that it's probably a fantasy, but she wishes that some statues of Lenin could stay so that it would be harder to prevent kids from getting real answers to questions about the past that come up because these things are unavoidable in culture. If a child asks who's Lenin, that's 100 years of history. You can't explain that in a moment. And that having these like touchstones around of what happened, or at least what narratives exist about what happened, would make it easier to continue to engage that moving forward.
I have so much to say to that. I'm really loving, Valeria, that you're bringing this up because, you know, it is very easily mistaken for the same situation when Confederate statues are removed in the American South and when communist Stalinist statues are removed in Eastern Europe. And it's actually the exact opposite situation. But in Eastern Europe, there is this kind of official state discourse of decommunization and of going back to our roots right? The real identity, the pre-communist identity, with the attempt of actually completely erasing the 5 or so decades of communism and also the individual people's agency in the creation of communism, especially from the perspective of Europe, so the former satellite countries of the Soviet Union. It is very easy to say it wasn't us, it was the Soviets. Whoever the Soviets were, they weren't Polish, they weren't Hungarian, right? There were these other people who colonized us. So what I find is actually very often, I mean, I find it to be an overreach, an overstatement in saying that the Soviet domination was the same of colonization, because it allows Eastern European subjects to put themselves in the position of the victim, to completely delegate any responsibility and any agency that they in fact had, and in a way to hijack the discourse of decolonization and decoloniality for their own purposes, which very often actually leads to nationalism. So it's a very complicated issue, because on the face value, it looks like decommunization and decolonization are similar, but in fact, they're almost the opposite. I mean, with some nuances and details, almost the opposite. And here, the fascinating thing to find is when you look into the actual 1950s in the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc, and as an art historian, that's the period I research, you find that the discourse of I mean, it was used at that time, the term was called anti-colonial. So the discourse of anti-colonialism was actually a part of the official communist ideology. So the generation of people who are adults and who are kids at school in the 1950s and the 1960s, they're actually taught about imperialism, about colonialism as negative things, as the evils. And they're very well aware of these things that my generation, born in the 80s, is not aware of, because with getting rid of communism, right, and the ideology of communism, we also got rid of everything. We basically threw the baby out of the bathwater. And we need to now in Eastern Europe kind of reinvent this discourse, and it can only find that these conversations were already being had by our grandparents, but not by us.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah.
If I could also, thank you so much, Magdalena. I'm just, and Valeria, this is everyone, this is wonderful. I wanted to kind of jump in around this idea of monument. And Valeria, I was, you know, when you were presenting originally about thinking of this idea of the replacing, there's a new text that's coming out by Green Lantern Press in Chicago from Romy Crawford. Magdalena, you may know Romy from various departments. That's called Fleeting Monuments for the Black Arts Movement. And basically it was an invitational text that I've contributed, Fred Moten, there are other folks who have contributed to rethinking the idea of what a monument can be. And I'm really excited. I've not seen anybody's contributions except, you know, my own. But, you know, I'm really interested because it's reflecting the wall of respect in terms of this, you know, this point in time of the gathering of artists to create this, you know, wall that was also a conversation with the neighborhood. There were even police. Barbara Jones-Hogu talked about being up on the scaffolding, painting this, and that the idea of Black self-determination in just painting the wall, there were police actually training snipers, training their guns on the artists just in case, you know, which you go from there and then you think, okay, in the present day, this actually, it doesn't seem strange because how much has changed. But so thinking about, you know, so in terms of, you know, back to this idea of what are the options or what are the ways that we are transforming, rethinking what a monument can be, rethinking where a monument can exist, who has the power to shape that, and yeah. You want to jump? Sure.
This for me, to me again. Wow. I don't know. It is for me. That of course, that is very complicated problem for all of us. But mostly that monument is the memorial, yeah. And the second, that is a piece of art, and the third, that is history, bad or good. The history mostly is bad. All of history. And we should fix this point of our bad, common bad history. That is my feeling. I'm not sure. I'm not. Sometimes I'm afraid to say this, but I prefer to keep the monuments, all of the art monuments, to keep on the streets with explanation, but they should stay. I'm sorry.
And one also, Valeria, thinking about monument and this erasure, I'm also brought to mind, and this is something that a lot of some of my former mentors when I was at the Art Institute as a student have been working on the torture justice memorials for Chicago, and particularly for Black men in particular in the city who were tortured into false confessions, primarily by John Burge, in District 1, who I think is living in Florida on pension. Don't correct me if I'm wrong, but I can't hardly talk about it with getting so angry. But there's been a lot of work, and actually happening right now, with proposals that are being developed for Torture Memorial, as well as just the Torture Justice Fund. And so it's this known history. In Chicago, even the site where the Art Institute works is a Black site. And unfortunately, there we have even this terminology of like Black, how that's being used. On the West Side, where it's a site of disappearance, where police would basically take, Black and brown people from the West Side, and they would disappear into this building. And so this bringing out of the monument and saying, these histories happened. This is part of this city. You are not going to sit there in Florida on pension while people whose lives have been completely destroyed. And it's a huge part of like generations who were affected, and we continue to be affected. So that visibility becomes a kind of a way of, reshaping in some ways, or bringing these hidden histories and reconstruction of that official story.
On the other hand, we have a good example of change the monuments is in Uzbekistan, in Tashkent. In the center of the city is staying a monument to Amir Tamerlan. You say Tamerlan, okay. That is the 10th monument on the same time. During last 100 years, 10 monuments changed on the one place, because different stories and different artists and different, that is future of all of destroying demolished monuments. Thank you.
I'm not sure, Valeria, if I understand you exactly correctly in terms of that, like there's a constant shifting of the monuments on that same location. I find that an interesting exercise in terms of,
yeah, and one our artist created the project.
Right.
Yeah.
And that we have these many stories and these many ways of depicting, and so that goes back to this dynamism rather than the static factor that we were talking about earlier. And I think that's a really exciting opportunity, I think, as well as this idea of like the creation of new symbols, and the way I think, as far as Nugent's work, this deconstruction of the alphabet and speaking to this idea of loss. I think about Sonia Clark's work, where she's traveling histories in terms of hair and textile, her Jamaican family going to Scotland, going to the continent of Africa and West Africa. She created in Senegal, she created an alphabet out of the curls of her Afro hair. And she worked with a Senegalese artist who is himself a speaker of one of the languages that's sort of dying out. And so he also has created his own alphabet. And so, that's also something, in terms of like this decolonization that I think about a lot, and in our our class, you know, this kind of idea that Africa is, you know, always this reduction to an oral tradition, or, you know, and it's like, no, there are so many languages that existed in symbolic and written form, you know, and mixed in every way, you know, even in Northern Akan, vessels that would be artisans that would inscribe Arabic lettering, and they didn't necessarily know what it said, but they knew the lettering was protective because it's used on garments and other, you know, so, you know, this idea of like debunking this kind of mythology that's been created, again, constructed around the lack of written language, or around the lack of monument, or the, you know, I think these new experiments around what language can be, or the deconstruction as Nugent's doing, these are the kinds of things that are moving us forward in terms of understanding, even just this idea that language is destabilized, that that starts something, you know, it catalyzes something. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this discussion, because what we are doing is trying to connect these various positions of Eastern Europe, Central Asia, with those of the Global South. And I see the lack of this kind of dialogue, and often connected to what Magda spoke about, is that how decolonialism is approached, it actually becomes a form of reaching to authenticity for victimization. And then you see these competing decolonial projects of victimization, of showing that we need to reach back to our authentic culture to contest the colonial power or the erasures. But then how to connect these? So I'm just interested in your visions of possible future where we could connect, not just in dialogue, but through art, through monuments, for example, and through exhibitions, connect these in a shared history, right? And show that actually they are about the same, and show use our historic origin, you know, and the body that we discussed before, transform it in some kind of a vision of a future, as in Denenge's work, you see in Afrofuturity. So I'm interested in your thoughts of moving forward into a shared way of understanding and using this these specific historical positions that we often discuss. Yeah, but this is a very wide issue, I guess. So I think it will be best to start. We don't have much time, so let's open up to the Q&A, because I guess that others are, I can see from the chat and I get messages that people would like to start. So I'd like to ask people, if you want to have questions, to raise your hand, and I'll be also reading out some of the questions that we got here, if you'd like to react. Okay. So I can see, first of all, yeah, Adele Eisenstein. I'd just like to also ask, for example, here, Adele, would you like to speak, or should I? If somebody wants to speak, then just raise your hand. Okay, otherwise I'll just read it out. Okay, so Adele talked about that. I always think that about the sculpture park at the edge of Budapest, where people have to choose to go to visit these outdated monuments and learn their history and context. So think about Budapest, and that she says that it's important to have this discussion about monuments, to have this trans or international cultural framework. It's important that Magdalena said that the question of Soviet monuments is sort of the opposite of the question of Confederate monuments. And I agree with Valeria so much about contextualizing monuments, as they would say. And Emily Scheuer also wrote that, yeah, I'm looking at the Q&A section now. She said, "Thank you all for your brilliant presentations and comments. I was really interested in Denenge's reference to Lukasha memory boards and the ways in which the points on the board serve as a physical touchstone from which to tell oral history. I wonder what decolonized forms of physical touchstones, memorials in our social space might best enable us to return to histories we might want to forget as a way of taking ownership over these histories, those histories." Do you like to address the issue of the memory boards? Denenge. You're muted, please.
Yeah, all right. Thank you, Emily. So I have found these fascinating, and speaking of decolonization, the Luba Lukasa memory boards were the first, I think one of the first major collections of art that I saw when I was, as I like to say, fresh off the boat from Nigeria. I was at Smith College and I had the opportunity to do an internship. They select people every semester, every year, a group of 12 students to go to the Smithsonian Institution, and they put you in different museums, and then you work on a curatorial project, which is where I learned about King Ajimam Prempe's Adinkra cloth, which is a commemorative textile. And I think that term, you know, commemorative is something that I also wanted to throw into the mix, Valeria and Magdalena, in terms of what we were talking about, in terms of the function of a monument, this idea of commemorating, and the many forms that a commemoration can take, you know, on a personal level or on a larger level. That a cloth is a commemoration. You know, I work in textile of thinking about commemoration, and many of Nugent's works I think are also, you know, that each of the artists that we're talking about, that there's this idea of commemorating histories so that, you know, it was here, you know, and it functions as historical document. And so as far as the Luba Lukasa boards, I was very fresh in my ideas about things. I was very, you know, am very passionate. And I felt like each of these they're about, you know, handheld device, and they were each in their own vitrine and this gray museum space, and one after the other in this dark room. And I felt like I could hear them screaming. I don't know if it's my youthful, like, you know, enthusiasm, but I just, you know, my whole paper was this impassioned writing, you know, 120 pages about the exhibition of African art in the Western Museum, and, you know, and the problems and the, you know, and I wanted to just like smash the vitrines and free the sculptures. And, you know, I was just so like, it made me like, I was just so emotionally overwrought by the idea of these works that I felt were completely disconnected from their origin. I mean, and you know, origin is, I mean, we also have to think about agency of individuals where, okay, somebody this may not have any more spiritual purpose yet anymore. And so an individual or a community would sell it to a museum, or it would be acquired. So it goes back to this authenticity, you know, this assumption of authenticity that you were mentioning, Zoltan. So but I just remember the Luba Lukasa and how it struck me, and maybe it was also the anthropomorphism, you know, and the fact that it was a figure, but there's so much information that's contained within that. And so I felt, you know, this idea that it's a figure, some of them even fit together. There's, you know, almost like a male female pieces, you know, and all of this information also links to conceptual, spiritual ideas, as well as architectural concepts. And so it's functioning on all these levels. And I guess I just, I find that exciting. And that's why I always like to show this slide, because I'm also obsessed with cuneiform tablets. I just think they're so cool. Imagine getting a love letter and it's in a little clay tablet, and you tap it open, and, you know, bill of sale, whatever it might be. But there's something so haptic about that. And so I like your question around forms of physical touchstones, memorials. I was very moved, you know, I went to Smith College. So Maya Lin, who's just done some major architectural design work for the school, This was during a time when she had just finished with the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And the way that people were embracing that, at first it was contentious in terms of the design. And then when people realized you can go up to this and people are taking rubbings of people's names, you know, and to see the text, the names, you know, in this form that you move along, there was something about the haptic, the interaction, the individual, yet also this representation of the fullness of this history, of all of the lives, that I think really affected me in my early days of thinking about this kind of thing. So I'm not sure. I feel like this is for artists to develop, you know, what can that be in social space? You know, I also think about, you know, in terms of disability, people's physical access, you know, when you're talking about physical touch, for those who may, you know, wish or have ability to use their hands with it or other part of the body in order of, you know, engaging. What are the ways we can reimagine the entire experience of a memorial and of a commemoration that also can live beyond the physicality of being in a particular space? And I think that's where we come to, Zoltan, this larger idea around the connections that are being made in these conversations. Because even yesterday in class, a student was presenting and she talked about Hassan, oh goodness, I'm forgetting the name, of artist who does all of this gestural text-based painting. Anyway, and she said, oh, I was really surprised that he was inspired by Andy Warhol. And why is this? I'm inspired by things from all over the world. You know, is that just because I was raised internationally? This kind of seeing ourselves always as separate, I find it so problematic. Why wouldn't I be inspired by an artist in Hungary or Uzbekistan or Tokyo, wherever, you know, like, if our languages, if our concepts, if our ideas are the same, you know, or have simpatico energies, I just think that, you know, for me, that's part of the teaching of it is, listen, it's not, why would you be surprised? I find it irritating, to be honest. I can't get irritated with my students like that. I have to teach them.
Yeah, I also think that thinking about future, we have to think about the, you know, problems, challenges, and also the ways to make exhibitions travel. And
Right.
what does it make a difference? And what difference does it make, and how to do it to bring it, for example, to Eastern Europe, for example, to Budapest or somewhere else, right? I think we need to develop these connections, and not just in conversation, but through, you know, joint work. And I just raised our own exhibition because I think it's worth to see and compare our own experiences and our own challenges, and see that this is, you know, a joint fight that we are doing to rethink not just decolonialism as it is, but new ways of actually doing this structural change, right, through art and exhibitions. And I'm really glad that this is happening. I was really excited when I had to prepare. And we went through some amazing questions. I don't see any other extras in the Q&A, extra questions, and we're just right out of time. So I wanted to leave you with this, that I'm very excited, and actually I'm looking forward to the future, and I'm very glad that I met you, because I'm very excited about what else we can do in the future. So let's keep in touch. And thank you for the audience for being with us. And thank you, everyone. Yes, I can see the people are the greetings.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all the comments in the chat, too, for everyone for engaging.
So we have recorded this, and it's going to be shared on the Wellesley site, which we linked in. Okay, so.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting, really very interesting. And thank you all of my colleagues And Rose, thank you, especially you.
Lovely to meet you, Valeria.
Thank you again, Ross, for the amazing job that you've been doing, and all the other people we involved in organizing, especially Zuzanna, who put this together. So a big thank you to all of you, and thank you also, Randi Hopkins, for being with us.